Aaron Daniels from the Healthy Creative podcast shares his passion for creativity with you. If you're looking for interesting creative and design conversations, or just simple and effective ways to get more creativity into your life, then this show is for you. Aaron and his guests deliver simple, effective advice that promotes inclusion into creativity rather than unnecessary exclusion. Creativity isn't just for creative types. The result? A sharper, smarter, more creative you. Now it's time to join your host Aaron Daniels for the Healthy Creative podcast.
Hello friends, welcome to the latest episode of the Healthy Creative podcast, brought to you by healthycreative.co.uk. I'm Aaron Daniels. I've worked in London's world-class creative industry for a number of years now. I work within design and art direction, but I've got a serious appetite for all things creative. Tom Foley is my guest today. He's creative type director at Monotype. This is part 2. In this part, we're going to learn about the intricacies of designing a typeface. It's a beautiful process.
So once you've established your brief and worked with your client and you kind of know what problem you're trying to solve, I mentioned earlier, like if you're designing for long form reading in print, you've got very different considerations in terms of design features than you do if you're designing a display typeface that's going to be used on gigantic posters or in logos. And I think people have the impression that typeface designers work on their own in a dark room, quite fastidiously drawing curves and kerning and spacing. It's actually not like that. Typeface designers work very collaboratively these days. You have to understand where your typefaces are going to exist, where they're going to be used, and to make them really good, you have to really work very closely with the end client. The general process that you go through and the stages that we go through as designers tend to be quite consistent. So usually what we would do is we would start with a very small set of characters. So just maybe 9, 11 characters, something like that. And they're what we call key glyphs. And they're usually lowercase only. And so it's characters like the lowercase n, lowercase o, lowercase v. And they're important because the N gives you information and sort of parameters for straight stems and for square characters, because it's pretty much square in its profile. The O, obviously it's round, so it gives you kind of information for curves and parameters for curves. And the V, being a diagonal, it gives you parameters for diagonals. So within those 3 characters, you can already establish the vertical stem weight, the horizontal stem weight, the level of contrast, the shape of the serifs, some basic proportions. So the relationship between the width of the N and the width of the O is very important because they really need to balance with one another optically in terms of their internal white space. And then we can start to look at characters that have ascenders. So that's a character like the H, and an ascender is the part of the character which comes above the X height. And then characters with descenders like a P or a Q. And again, that's a character with a stem or a straight line that goes below the baseline, so the bottom of the N. And they're important because they start to give us what we call vertical metrics information. They establish parameters for the height of the ascender in relation to the X height. And that's quite important because if, for example, a typeface has a very long ascender and a short X height, that's something that's generally a display feature, a typeface for large sizes. Mm-hmm. But if a typeface needs to be used in small sizes or used in many, many different kinds of environments, generally it will need a slightly larger X height, and the ascender height then was in relation to that will shorten. And then once we have those things established, we can then include characters like, for example, lowercase s, which is an unusually shaped character, or a lowercase t, which has a kind of an asymmetric shape. And again, that's really good just for establishing proportional features. So once we've designed those handful of characters and we're happy with how they're going, and usually what I would do is I would design many different design directions with a small set of characters to explore as much as possible the brief and the possible ways we can solve the brief. Maybe the client will pick one of those and be happy with one of those, and then I'll start to extend the character set out. So I'll include some more lowercase characters, some capital characters, maybe a couple of figures or numbers, just to start to flesh out that concept and prove it across different characters. And then we can also start to do what we call weight tests. So up until that point, usually we will have only designed in, say, the Roman or the regular weight. But at this point, we can actually start to design the light or the lightest weight we need and the boldest weight we need, and start to design a system rather than designing individual characters. And this is where we start to think like type designers and get really process driven, because a typeface is a pretty complex system of shapes and proportions, and even though they're pretty small file sizes, they're actually pretty complex things. So designing in that way then allows us to make sure that our information across our family of weights is consistent. And then, once we get the weights working in the right way, and we establish which weights we need to answer the brief, we can extend the character set even more. So finish off all the uppercase, all the lowercase, finish all the punctuation and the numbers or the figures in all the weights that we need, or at least in the extreme weights, so the lightest weight or the boldest weight. Because at that point, what usually has happened is that we've established a pretty good system of shapes and of weight, and we can actually use those two extremes, the boldest and the lightest, to generate weight instances in between. And that's a process that's called interpolation, or often called multiple master design. And most typefaces nowadays have many weights and many styles, and you can't redesign them within a reasonable time frame.
I was going to say, that was my question. The next question is time. How long does this take?
It really depends on the character set. I mean, you could design a typeface in 3 weights for use for most European languages within 3 months, 4 months. But if you're extending to other languages, for example, if you were to design for a Bengali, which is a North Indic writing system, it could take you 8 to 9 months.
Wow.
If you're designing for Chinese, it could take a year to 18 months, depending on what standard of Chinese you're designing to. So it varies a lot depending on it depends on the complexity of the design, the spec, the language support, all that stuff. So once we have our uppercase, lowercase, and basic punctuation and stuff established, it's always good to test. And if you're designing a typeface for somebody else, you should really test with them and be as collaborative as possible. Through all of the design phases, it's good to just try out the typeface in the environment it's going to be used in. A really common milestone in typeface design is ASCII Set. So ASCII Set is basically very close to what you see on an English keyboard. And if you have that many characters designed, you can test really well for at least English language usage and get a good indication then of things like texture. And what I mean by texture is basically how the typeface looks in a paragraph of text, and if it has a kind of an even quality or if it's kind of broken, and that's really important for testing proportions and weight and consistency, optical consistency of things. And it's very important to understand in typeface design, it's not about mathematical consistency, it's about optical consistency and about making things look optically correct. A good example of that is if you take a lowercase o and you compare it to a lowercase x, and if you were to draw a line across the top of the x and the bottom of the x and overlay the o onto it, you'll see the o is actually bigger mathematically than the x. That's called overshoot. That's an optical correction that we do in typeface design to make round characters look optically as large as square characters.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's lots of other examples of that within a typeface system, but those kinds of considerations are what matter, particularly when you're looking at a typeface used at small sizes. Another good example of that, if you look at the size of a terminal, and a terminal is basically the end of a stroke or a stroke that has an ending on a lowercase r, compared to the size of a terminal on a lowercase c, they're different because they occupy different spaces. They're optically balanced and they look consistent, but if you mathematically compare them, they should be different. So again, once you reach a kind of a milestone with the character set where you can test in more rigorously, it's always good to do that. Get feedback from the user or the client or whoever is going to use this typeface, and then apply those changes as you design. And then usually once you hit the basic English set, you can then quite quickly start to build the typeface out to cover the language support you need, at least within the Latin script system. And then it's all just really about a lot of iteration, testing, proofing, refining, applying feedback. And my experience is mainly in custom typeface design. What I mean by that is designing typefaces for specific uses, for clients or brands, or for specific technologies or specific rendering and rasterizers. And that requires an awful lot of testing and an awful lot of collaboration with clients. So again, in terms of process, and particularly in a commercial environment where you want to turn these products around pretty quickly and cost effectively. Testing is very important, because if you don't test them, how do you know what you're going to get at the end? So if, for example, this typeface that we're designing is going to be used on screens, once the design is complete, the next thing we look at is kerning. And what kerning is, again, it's about optical adjustments to critical letter pair combinations to ensure that when a typeface is used at smaller sizes, you don't get big white gaps appearing where you don't want them. A really good example of that is if you take a capital H, a capital V, and a capital O and put them in a string. If there was no kerning in there, these characters would have big white spaces between them. And the reason for that is each character has a limit to its left and right extremes, and that's called side bearings. Side bearings are used to kind of define the limit of a character. And that's called spacing, and spacing will solve about 85% of your letter pair combinations in a typeface. Kerning fixes the other 15%.
Okay.
And so we just fix those critical problems. And once that's done, so we have everything drawn and spaced and kerned and all the characters are in place and the language coverage is there, we kind of move away from design processes into more technical processes. So if this typeface that we're designing needs some sort of special feature, so if, say for example, we were designing this typeface for a brand and that brand wanted to put their logo into the typeface, we can do things like we can include open type features, and open type is it's basically the intelligence inside a typeface. So we could, for example, define that if a user types hashtag and the name of the brand, that the typeface calls in the logo and displays it for them on the screen. So that's open type engineering, open type features, and they're also used for things like ligatures. So if a user is typing an F and the F is followed by an I, sometimes the top part of the F clashes with the dot of the I, and what the type designer will do is they will design another version of that character, those character combinations, called an FI ligature, and then that's called in using open type features. So that kind of stuff is built. Now open type engineering gets more complex as you move away from kind of typical shaping or typical behaviors in typefaces. So for example, if you were designing a handwritten typeface, or a typeface that had to look like handwriting, open type can get very, very complex, because to make a typeface look handwritten, you have to have lots of substitutions and ligatures and combinations. Or if you're designing for a complex writing system such as Bengali, for example, which has really complicated shaping. It's not an alphabet like our writing system. It's an alpha syllabary, so it's quite complex. So when you type, when a user types a consonant followed by a vowel, or what happens is that consonant changes shape into a conjunct form, and that's controlled by open type. That's a whole other world of complexity in terms of design and engineering. But once you've got that established and tested and working, you can then move into the next phase, which is usually hinting. And hinting is a process of controlling how operating systems render typefaces on screens. Hinting is a process that's been around now since the dawn of digital type. It's really just about controlling pixel placement. The type design industry probably thought that we would no longer be doing hinting nowadays, because we assume that with the development of high resolution screens and better technologies that it wouldn't be required, but it still is, because
it's basically judging how these sit in terms of pixels.
So if you can imagine typing something in a text editor, any sort of text editor, and you set it at 10 point. That 10 point is actually it's a grid of pixels, and depending upon the resolution of your device, you get a different rendition.
Yep, makes sense.
So if you were designing this typeface to work for a low resolution device, you would need to control very carefully the placement of those pixels, or the instructions that you give the operating system to render the pixels to give the best possible version of the shapes you've drawn. Because when a typeface designer is drawing a typeface, they're actually drawing in really high resolution, high definition curves. But when you put it into a computer system, it often changes into pixels. So it's about controlling that translation. And then once your hinting is done and it's signed off, usually it goes into final testing and packaging, and then it's sent off to the client as a finished product.
They would basically receive a font file, and that's their font.
That's it, yeah.
No.
It's 40 kilobytes. That's it.
Boom.
Boom.
Install. Drop down menu.
Absolutely.
When I get given stuff, because it's heavily image based,
Mm.
it makes life a lot easier. It's this image. It communicates these things.
Yeah.
Whereas with the typeface, there's a lot less to work with in a way.
There's less room, yeah, but there's also conventions. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, there's like fashion or luxury brands tend to have certain features in their typography. So maybe it's a modern style, high contrast, a certain level, which gives a kind of a feeling of elegance. So, delicate hairlines, delicate serifs. You can play with basic psychology of shapes. For example, particularly in the Western world, round things tend to be friendly, approachable. Square shapes tend to be more authoritative and stable. Spiky things tend to be more edgy or aggressive. There's lots you can do, and then it's really just about establishing with the client what they mean by professional, what they mean by friendly, and how they envisage those features being expressed in a typeface. And then we do exercises where we look at, we can analyze and look at existing typefaces that have some of the qualities that they like, and then how we can take some inspiration from those perhaps and work them into a new design. But there is a lot of scope within a typeface to create uniqueness, because if you think about, there are lots of typefaces out there, but there are lots of typefaces of the same kind out there. There is lots of room for us to explore new styles and new features and new shapes. So it may seem like an impossible task, but it really isn't. It's actually it's quite enjoyable, quite exciting. And it's really the funnest part of designing a typeface is those initial conversations about what's the newness, what's the originality, how do we find the unique expression.
So how do you get inspiration for your font design?
Some designers take a lot of inspiration from history. So, for example, reviving an existing typeface. And some designers have made careers out of going back to typefaces that existed, for example, in metal type, and reviving those for digital, things like that. And some designers are just very experimental and push the boundaries of what's possible in terms of making a typeface new, but also still legible and readable. I find constraints really useful for creating originality in typeface design, because if you're given endless parameters, you can create something completely out there and unique, but it might be completely useless. Nobody might want to use it, might not answer any questions or contribute anything to kind of real usage cases. I quite like designing typefaces that have like a kind of a workhorse requirement, a typeface that needs to be used or at small sizes or at varying sizes and carry a lot of content, because they can be the most difficult typefaces.
There's a variety of span.
Yeah, it's
the cover.
It is. Yeah, it's the usage. It's the designing typefaces for small sizes is probably the most challenging in terms of they have to be so solid and rationalized as a system. But I've been lucky enough to design typefaces for different writing systems. And that's a whole other world of complexity. And
what do you mean by that? Is that script?
Yeah.
Mandarin? Or?
Yeah, so for Bengali or Tamil, there's such different ways of writing to the way we write and ways of thinking culturally to the way we think.
So how do you even approach that? Do you speak the languages that you design for?
No, I don't. And that's a really good question. I have to kind of caveat that I don't work in isolation on those designs. Just to kind of give an insight, every writing system, every script is a system. It's a system of shapes, and all writing systems are heavily rationalized. They're very systematic and they got rules. So understanding the rules of how a writing system shapes itself is in a way independent of understanding it as a reader.
So if I read a book, I don't need to understand how the typeface got there.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a good way of looking at it. But then when you design typefaces for script systems that you don't read, you do need to work very closely with native speakers. Things you need to really understand quite deeply are what are the writing origins of that typeface or that script system, so that you can translate those successfully into the typeface. And where you often see a common problem is when typeface designers from the West would design typefaces for Arabic, for example. And a lot of poor Arabic typefaces show things like contrast in the wrong place, oversimplification of details, standardized proportions, things becoming too static, and kind of forcing Latin typographic features onto Arabic typefaces.
That's interesting.
Things like that.
So a designer might take their cues from a different writing system and also their own creative design cues, not understanding the language, and then make something that's not interpreted well.
Absolutely, and not understanding the writing origins is the main thing. So you really have to understand how a writing system evolved. So, Latin started on stone, whereas something like Tamil was written and evolved through being written on palm leaves, which is a very different way of writing and puts different restrictions on how a person can write. So Tamil has its really round circular features. They would write with a stylus, kind of a soft pointed pen on a palm leaf, and then because of the venation in the palm leaf, the forms need to be very round, otherwise you pierce the leaf. And that's now ingrained into the writing system.
Is that similar to Thai as well?
Thai as well, yeah. So they have a similar Brahmic root. So you have to understand those origins and then practice writing on those basis before you even begin to consider.
So you actually begin to try and write it by hand.
Yeah. So a lot of what you'll see type designers doing when particularly if they're learning to design a new script system, is that they will go to primary school writing books for those writing systems, and they'll do the basic exercises, much like when you're a kid. You trace the ABC because it has to become sort of innate that you understand the construction and the order of the strokes and the proportions. They're really the really basic things you need to understand. And then once you get those down, you can then work with a native speaker to understand how you translate the features from the Latin into the other script system. Again, you have to be very sensitive to what works in a Latin in certain instances won't work in a Bengali or Tamil or an Arabic. You have to be very careful there.
Do people make an effort to actually try to do that, or just? I guess my question is, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to put Western style font design into Arabic?
So it's not really about putting Western style. It's about creating a typeface system where if a user wants to have a consistent tone of voice across different regions in the world, and that's more of probably a consideration for brands who want to brand themselves. But even in terms of utility, if you're a book typesetter and you have to set a book in Arabic and Latin, you probably want to have a typeface that when you set the Latin and set the Arabic, even if they're not side by side, they have a similar texture, similar rhythm, similar metrics and overall scale. Even in that situation, you really need to be considerate of how you make these two very different writing systems complement
and still feel like a family,
and still feel like they really complement one another, because you can't make them the same, but you can make them work together as well as possible.
Is accessibility in font design becoming increasingly important these days?
I think it's becoming more of a common request, particularly nowadays. We have a lot more custom typefaces around, so a lot more brands are producing their own in-house designs. A lot of these brands, very few brands, particularly anyone on a global scale, they are required to exist on the web, and they're required to reach usually a broad demographic. So some level of accessibility will be in there somewhere. Obviously, institutions that have more of a focus on broad demographics, or if they're governmental or they're national institutions, they will have accessibility requirements, and that will inform more of the design. But as a type designer, if you're designing a typeface that has to be read by a lot of people of different ages across different regions in the world, and maybe the typeface itself will be used in challenging environments, you want to try and aid legibility as much as possible. Accessibility in typography is not just to do with the typeface, it's to do with how the typeface is used. So scale, background colour, space, leading, all those things contribute to how accessible a piece of content is. And a typeface can do certain things and help in many ways, but it can't solve all accessibility issues.
In this digital revolution we're experiencing, typography has a part to play in that. Fundamental changes that are happening digitally. So how do we innovate typographically? What are the challenges in typography today? What happens outside the public's eye?
Typeface design has always been affected by technology, always, and it's always been very much linked to shifts from if it be from metal to photo typesetting to digital and so forth. And today, no exception, like digital typography really has been around as an industry for 30 years. So it's still pretty new. If you think about how long metal type was an established industry. It was like hundreds of years. So digital type has kind of only come upon us, and already it's evolving at a frightening pace. The quality of typefaces has improved vastly over the last 20 years as technologies have improved for rendering and for displaying type. And, you know, even the way we make typefaces now, the programs that we use are better than they were 15, 20 years ago, and they're faster, and they're allowing us to make typefaces of better quality and more consistent. So the level is always going up and up and up. But then in terms of major shifts going forward, I mean, obviously we have AR and VR, which are been kind of cited as the next big changes in how we consume information as users, mass consumption of information. So for example, if you're in a VR environment and you're playing, if it's a gaming environment, for example, and you've got all your dashboard display, your navigation, which is fixed, say, for example, as you're turning, as your environment backgrounds change color, how do you handle that in terms of rendering and display and refresh and all the screen rate? That's one thing. In augmented reality, where, you know, again, if you're using an application or through the augmented reality device, you're projecting content onto an environment. Again, how do you control how the type renders and is illuminated correctly? Does it respond in a way that it kind of responds to the environment? So those are real challenges, and one potential solution or one potential evolution or development in the type design industry is a new specification of type format called variable fonts. So variable fonts, I don't know if you're aware of it.
I am aware of this research.
So variable fonts they're a new, basically, kind of a basic way to think about them is they're a new file format. So prior to variable fonts, when you install a typeface family on your computer, what you do is you install the light, the regular and the bold, and the italic, light, regular and bold. And they are separate font files, and you access them by clicking on your drop-down menu, and they're fixed. So your regular is fixed, your bold is fixed. With the variable typeface, when you install your variable typeface on your system, you no longer need to install a light, regular and bold plus its italic companions. They're all in one font file. On top of that, you can also pick intermediate weights potentially between your light and regular and bold. So basically, a variable font is a dynamic.
It's one file that can do a lot.
Yeah. Now, if you combine that potential of having a typeface that can kind of hit more variables in terms of weight and details within the design space, and attach that to a responsiveness or a dynamic environment, and make typeface respond to the environment, you may be able to solve some of the issues thrown up by AR or VR potentially. Where variable fonts have a real tangible benefit today is responsive web typography. So for example, if you're looking at a website for an e-commerce website, or you want to buy something online, and you're looking at it on your big widescreen monitor on your work computer, but then you want to continue the purchase on your way home on your phone, what's happening there is you're seeing two different versions of that site. So in terms of, at the moment, how typography and web typography is working is that every part of a website is potentially dynamic apart from the typeface. Typefaces are fixed.
Still locked.
They're still locked. They can't really respond in the same way. A variable font could allow for that responsiveness.
So basically all the big boys looking at variable fonts.
So variable fonts like Google, Microsoft, Apple and Adobe have all got behind them. So they will become a standard of some kind. Whether they'll solve all the problems people hope they will, I don't think they'll replace OTFs, TTFs, because it's difficult from for the font industry. It's difficult from a selling perspective. How do you price a variable font that can potentially have infinite instances between your two extreme points? So just to be really clear, as a user, I could literally have a scroll bar and decide the weight myself. Yeah, that's it. So usually what happens is the designer can specify instances in the axis that are default. So default recommended bold or recommended regular. But the user can, in a variable font, slide between those. Okay. Indefinitely.
with all the kind of voice operated interactions, your audio books, your Amazon Alexa, are these kind of voice operated experiences encroaching on typography?
They are changing the way users interact with certain kinds of content, how they access content probably. Whether they're replacing it, I guess the question is, does voice interaction and voice interfaces potentially make the need for reading redundant? And I think the answer there is no, because you still, even if you use a voice interface to access the content, if you want to go in deep, you've got two options. You can either listen to it or read it. At the moment, we have the ability to listen to content on the web, and it hasn't made type redundant. So I think the short answer is no. I think it's, as I said before, type is so ingrained in our culture and in the way that we understand information and understand our world nowadays. It's very hard to see how you could remove it without fundamentally changing the way we are educated, the way we interact with complicated information, the way we learn. So yeah, I can't see that happening.
I agree with you. I think typography will always be here. And I was just thinking myself about when I read, it's the process of slowing me down. Do you know what I mean? There's that fact of slowing you down to take in that information, printing stuff off and reading it through. I comprehend more rather than on a screen.
It's very interesting actually, because there's been some kind of fairly anecdotal research done, but because you and I are kind of on the cusp of the millennial generation, like we're probably used to reading books, because when we went to our college, the internet was shit and we had to read books. But apparently millennials have only ever really read from screens, and they seem to be more comfortable reading grotesques than humanists, which kind of flies in the face of a lot of established research that says that humanist designs generally lead to more comprehension and are therefore more legible. And it raises that old saying that you read best what you read most.
Okay.
And this is kind of where we need to get more scientific as an industry about understanding what legibility is in typeface design, because and there is work being done out there. People are again much more into this than I am, but understanding what happens in the brain when we read, and actually how does the brain process the shapes, the visual shapes of a typeface, and how do we then aid that process in the reader.
So what is the future of typography? What would you challenge? How would you challenge the status quo with it all?
So I'm quite fascinated by this idea of process and collaboration in design. I think I'm quite interested in the notion of collaborative design tools, being able to design a typeface in a very genuinely collaborative way, because even nowadays still, even as typeface designers collaborate on a typeface, the way it's made, it's still very much, you can't work on the same file at the same time. Now that might lead to chaos, but it'd be very interesting to see how it could work. In terms of then the outputs, then in terms of how I would challenge the status quo in the industry, I kind of just very much try and be user focused and client focused than practitioner focused.
You're not doing it for yourself?
Not doing it for myself, because there's a lot of people out there, I think, doing it for themselves. And I have nothing wrong with that, because creative people have a compulsion to create, and type designers are creative people, and they have every right to create on their own terms. But there's a lot of it around, and I think actually I personally am most impressed by typefaces that answer users' needs and clients' needs and genuinely kind of add value to a particular situation. And they're often not seen as genuine innovations by a lot of designers, because maybe the innovations are incremental, or maybe the innovations are in the technology or in the. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's still valid contributions and valid, I would say, innovations in the field, because it's easy to make something wild and wacky and crazy. It is. It's easy to do that. It's difficult to do that well, but it's just as difficult to make something function invisibly That's probably the hardest thing to do in typeface design.
That's interesting. Yeah. Do you work on any personal creative projects outside work?
Every day I sketch for about half an hour. So again, that's just pen, paper, sit down with a coffee, and I'll do some calligraphy, or I'll sketch some ideas for typefaces. And that's really important because I think most creative people, as they kind of go through the ranks, as you become a design manager, potentially a creative director or a type director, you do less and less design. Really, you're doing more sort of direction of the design, feedback, analysing, and helping others and developing other designers, and less development of your own craft skills. So the quickest way, or the easiest way for me to stay on top of that, is to sketch every day, because drawing typefaces by hand is the hardest way to draw typefaces. Other things I do, I teach occasionally. A few times a year I'll go to different universities and do workshops and work with students on briefs, and that's really good for putting what I do into context, because these students are not necessarily interested in typeface design, they're interested in typography, the broader discipline. So it allows me to step back away from type design and focus and look more at the use of typefaces and understand where my practice fits in the industry. And my wife runs her own design business. She's a textile designer. She has her own brand, so I actually do a lot of design for her, which is, it's not always fun.
I bet she's going to love that.
But it's really good because it allows me to step away from my day-to-day and look at type in a different way. And she's great because she allows me to use my typographic sensibilities to kind of lead her brand expression.
So what are the myths about typeface designers, and what would you want to dispel for anyone who wants to get creative and design their own fonts?
I would say don't be afraid to actually approach professional type designers and ask for help. I think when I was a student, I had the impression that type designers are very, very serious people who want to be left alone and don't want to share their knowledge, and the opposite is true, because the type design community is very open and it's very dynamic, and it's full of information and tips and help to improve your craft skills, your technical skills, whatever. So yeah, I would definitely advise to reach out to design professionals and ask them for their feedback, ask them for tips, ask them for any sort of guidance to kind of move into this industry, because it's very niche, it's very specific, and it's not for everyone, because you might try it and then realize you hate it. But if you really want to get into it, you really need to kind of get into the community and surround yourself with the people who comprise it, and they're great people. They're genuinely some of the most intelligent, wacky, helpful, kind people I know I've met in the industry, apart from yourself. Yeah.
So how do you learn and grow your knowledge and expertise? Do you have any links or resources, inspiration for our listeners to check out?
Yeah, sure. Up until maybe 4 years into my design career, I was a self-taught type designer, because I was probably too scared to approach professionals and ask for help. But I kind of referenced a book called Designing Type by Karen Cheng, and that was kind of my Bible for a few years, and I really learned a lot about all the basics of the crafts, like letter proportion process, how to build a typeface strategically, how to space a typeface correctly, how to kern a typeface correctly. And that was invaluable to me, and that was kind of, when I found that book again, it was one of those things I really lent on heavily, because there wasn't a lot of resources online at that time. So you're talking 10, 12 years ago, before the kind of internet really got full of content. But nowadays there's lots of stuff online. There's lots of blogs out there. There's one called I Love Typography, which is great because it covers all aspects of type. It talks about new font releases, the history of type, the process of designing type. It will also give you a good understanding of who's in the industry and who's out there. There's also many initiatives. There's a thing called Alphabets, which is an organization that's been set up to help young female designers get established in the type industry, which is really important because it's very much a male dominated industry at the moment, unfortunately. So that's great, and they have lots of articles on their website about top topics in the industry, various aspects of designing typefaces, and they also run a mentorship scheme. So they'll set you up with a professional designer who can guide your designs free of charge. And if you're really serious, there is a handful of really dedicated, fantastic postgraduate courses out there. There's one in Reading, there's one in The Hague, in KABK, and there's also one in Cooper Type in New York. But yeah, those postgraduate courses are really hardcore in their next level, but you know, they often accept the graphic designers that have experience in typography but no experience in type design. So you go in there and you learn how to design typeface.
So where would you like to send the listener to find out more information about you?
Just Google Tom Foley type designer and you'll get various articles, links in it, some videos. It should give you, it's probably not one centralized resource of who I am, because I'm not that famous yet or that established.
So before we put a full stop on this episode, see what I did there? Full stop, yeah. Nice. I should write the headlines for papers, I think. As the last question, what's the biggest thing you know now that you wish you'd known when you started out? What advice would you give to your high school self? To Tom Foley, age 16.
Age 16. Don't wear bootcut jeans. I might say so many things. I guess it's to make it meaningful to the listeners. Don't forget about work-life balance, because when I was a student, I thought I could only achieve by working harder than everybody else, which is ridiculous. And I would work ridiculous hours, and I would do at least one all-nighter a week. But I've come to learn over time that actually, to be a successful designer, you need to live a life. You need to actually have experience. You need experience. You need to have a life, and you need to experience things and understand what you're doing and where it fits into the world. Deep,
mate. That was Tom Foley. Thanks for coming on the show, Tom.
This has been fun.
Thank you to you too, the listener of the Healthy Creative Podcast. We're always keen to hear your perspective on anything discussed or we'd like to hear in the future episodes. If you're a new listener, please don't forget to subscribe and rate us on iTunes using the 5-star rating system. We want to make some more of these and get some great guests on. And we're done.
Cool, man. Great fun. Yeah, well done.
Appreciate it.